Okay. It appears I do remember you, but of course I'm not sharing your name, so I am not going to put it out there. But I helped you guys 5 years ago get a designated and trained aide specific for your nonverbal, nonambulatory son with cerebral palsy. We have had few problems with this until this year. We have had an IEP meeting to discuss our definition versus the school district's. Could you give a definition of this versus a one-on-one aid? This is always a tricky subject because the school systems, one of the biggest things that IEP teams frequently fight about is aid support. Okay, and so there's always I'm not going to say twisting, and I'm not necessarily saying it's intentional. With some, it's absolutely intentional. But it's all in wording, okay? Language is very important. I know that it's so convoluted today what language means, but language is important. And so how things are written into your IEP becomes very critical. And one of the things that you need to keep in mind as an IEP team member, especially those of you who don't get your IEP on the same day that you have your IEP meeting, which is ideal. That's the ideal thing. That way it's thrown up on the big screen and you're seeing it as it's being defined and written down in the IEP. But there's nothing wrong. It's not a violation of the law to send you your IEP later. Okay. Now at the same time, this is if they send your IEP to you later, this is sort of why it's important to record and notate correctly what was being determined in the meeting. Why is that? Because schools use that opportunity in between the meeting and you receiving your final copy to take liberties with wording. Okay, and aid support is one of those areas to where there's a lot of liberties taken with wording to the point where a parent is convinced that they have a one-to-one aid, a designated one-to-one aid for their child. And what that means is that there is an individual designated to be with the child throughout their day, from the point that they get dropped off to the point where they're picked up at the end of the day. That would be a designated one-to-one. Now, quite frankly, in my perspective and in my experience in this area, few children absolutely require a designated one-to-one aid, meaning from drop-off to pickup. Why is that? Well, because the entire point of a free, appropriate public education and the entire mission statement behind special education, period, is the mission statement is three things: independent living, economic viability, and continuing education. Okay, so independent living is a huge one. And so trying to identify those times throughout the child's school day to where they can be as independent as possible is very important. Can't really do that per the mission statement if your child is constantly strapped to a designated aid all day long. And so in that respect, you've got to sit there and balance that as an IEP team to acknowledge those areas where they absolutely need aid support in order to receive a free, appropriate public education. And that also comes into that accommodations aspect of the civil rights part of, let's say, a 504, which if your child has an IEP is just melded into the IEP itself. But, I'm talking about medical issues to where there is equal access. And so from that point, there needs to be that analysis of why does my child require this level of support? And so you have tiered levels of support that you need to look at and be serious about. And what are those areas? Okay, it could be my child elopes. My child is inattentive and needs constant redirection. Those things need to be ferreted out. How do you determine those things? Well, through things like functional behavior analysis. But many schools will sit there and say, well, we only look at let's say, bad behavior. Well, what's bad behavior? What, violation of the student code of conduct? And that's where they diminish that, because if they truly did a true analysis on whether the child's inattention and need for constant redirection and constant staff interaction impacts their learning, impacts areas of communication, and negatively impacts social emotional learning, which are all of three, the education for which most children have their goal development, then at that point you see we need a lot more aides, because that is a huge, huge issue with most of our kids, are those areas of inattention, need for redirection, and staff engagement. We have a huge area. We have a huge problem in this area. And so at that point, see, a lot of parents get confused as to where their kids need support. And that's where this argument comes in. So if you have, let's say, a child with complex medical issues, then at that point, see, that's that equal access aspect, 504, which is melded into the IEP, that goes in conjunction with that analysis on whether your child, whether it impedes their learning with regards to other aspects on the need for aid support, because that's the only way that they're able to receive that free appropriate public education, is with that level of support, in order to redirect, in order to have staff engagement, in order for your child to progress. So at that point, you bridge both of those together, and there are some children that require a designated aid throughout their day from beginning to end. Outside of that, then you would conduct an analysis on aspects of that to see where throughout the day that you could identify areas of independence for the child. Areas of independence. And you sort of work backwards. Where can we have them be independent, where they don't have aid support? Not the other way around. You know, where I call it targeted aid support, okay, which most schools don't have a problem with defining targeted aid support, but the devil's always in the details, okay? Because if you just sit there and say, they'll define it as adult support throughout the child's day. Well, what the hell does adult support mean? That could be anybody. Anybody that's employed with the school, anybody walking down the hallways that happens to be an adult would meet that definition of adult support throughout the day. That isn't feasible. With some kids, that's a ruse. It's BS. Because the adult support isn't sufficient. Because there could be a classroom teacher, but you got 20 kids. This child needs redirection. This child needs constant staff engagement. Well, how do you accomplish constant staff engagement with somebody that's just being adult supported, which would be the teacher in the class? The teacher isn't a superhero. All right? There's also 19 other kids to worry about. And so that's where you have to sit there and define what adult support means. And that turns into targeted aid support, not just adult support, targeted aid support. And then the best way to do this is to sit there and take your child's schedule from the time they get to school and chart it all the way down, starting at 8 o'clock and sometimes in 30-minute increments. What is the child doing? What is the expectation during this time? Does my child require support during this period of time, this block of time? If so, let's define that in there. Who is going to be doing that? And quite frankly, I think it's a lot easier to sit there and train multiple aides against your child's IEP. That way, you don't have to worry about inconsistency in programming. You're not having your child over-reliant on one adult. Your child will transition. You want your child to be acclimated to working with a variety of adults. So that's positive, as long as they're all trained the same in that consistency of implementing your child's program. I always recommend that. You don't know what's going to happen with the aid. You also don't want your child to have an over-reliance upon the aid to where it's learned helplessness, which can happen, which does happen, okay? So there's always that balancing act. And I know schools will use some of that stuff against you and say, well, we don't want learned helplessness. True, but we're not there yet. That might be the case, but let's have a myriad of adults. Let's identify those spots where my child can be independent. And let's define those places to where they need that support in order to receive either equal access or contribute to their access to free, appropriate public education against the general curriculum. Okay? Because that's the other balancing. Remember, there's medical for equal access. And then there's also and that could also expand over into other areas, guys. When I say medical, I'm saying if your child has an IEP, then so much of the 504 components are also dealt with there. So yes, I'm not purposely generalizing the medical aspect. more to that than just that. But with regards to that analysis, it's very important to do that. But like I said, the best way to do that is to break down your child's schedule, which a lot of IEP teams don't do. They don't think about it, or they don't want to do it that way. Because if they do that, then, oh my gosh, now you got accountability. Now you can define it. And there should be meeting minutes to where it's defined so that everybody on the team can see who's supposed to be where, who's supposed to be with who, so that you have accountability. That way it's just not some vague, ambiguous adult support that's written in there. The reality is that we don't have enough aides right now, guys. I mean, I can tell you all over the state and in multiple states, we don't have enough aides. Why is that? Because we got a pandemic and we're paying people not to work. So people aren't working. So the government response is contributing to why your children can't receive a free, appropriate public education. But I've warned about that. All right, now we're seeing it firsthand. You can't sit there and incentivize people not to work because they won't work. That's just the reality with humans. Okay? So unfortunately, when things get really bad, then all of a sudden there's everybody wants to be an aide. And we'll get to that at some point. Then we'll have too many aides because everybody will want to be an aide. So I guess there's a positive side to economic downturns, right? But that's where you break it down. You need to break it down. You need it defined. And don't be oppositional about it. Targeted aid support is good. It can be one-to-one. But identify the places where your child can be independent as well. And this is where it appears as though you're working with the school system. And quite frankly, you are working with the school system. Because I haven't met that many parents that say, my child needs an aide all the time. There are children like that. But most parents are reasonable and goes, no, I don't think my kid needs this all day. It's all in defining it, and it's all in breaking it down so that everybody understands what everybody's supposed to be doing. Define it. Define it, define it, define it, broken down by the child's schedule. Don't be afraid to come back, look at the data every, let's say, quarter or every semester to sit there and see whether adjustments need to be made and whether or not things are working as they're supposed to. And then set goals to sit there and give your child more opportunities for independence. That's the entire part of this, guys. It's an educational performance area. It is one of the purposes behind the IDEA is independent living. Independent living doesn't come with an aid all the time. So we need to have that be a bigger, broader goal for all of our kids, acknowledging the limitations and what they need at the time, and then progress. That's how that should be done.